but it's quite interesting, in terms of like the rules of the game, as you just described. I was considered to be someone who had won. I was on stage, I had enough money to do what I wanted to do. Life was good, and so it's like, why on earth have you jacked all that in to be chasing around after some escaped cows at 3 o'clock in the morning? I mean, obviously that's not what I did it for, but you get the general idea. What on earth have you done? And that gets people's attention. And actually, that sense of I don't regret doing the music. It's been amazing, and I would encourage anyone to do the same thing. But the sense of purpose, like when you get up in the morning and you do hard physical work that's part of a plan that you thought about, that you think is important, there is no better or happier way to spend a day than that. And that's something that just gets so often overlooked in this sort of age of a lot of kind of very superficial pleasure that's quick to come and quick to go.
You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast with me, Dan Burgess. The concept of the Spaceship Earth is simple. We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. Like a spaceship, we have a finite amount of supplies with an intelligent operating system, which keeps everything we need replenished as long as we all respect it and use wisely. So an understanding of how this system works, along with deep cooperation between humans and all life, is essential to keep us thriving and the spaceship flying. In this podcast, I'm in conversation with humans involved in regenerating life, shifting consciousness, and reimagining how we can live more beautifully and peacefully. I talk with artists, activists, writers, designers, adventurers, healers, entrepreneurs, creative mavericks, and more. Their stories invite us to participate in the co-creation of a more beautiful, life-sustaining world, in service to life, becoming crew on the Spaceship Earth. Welcome to the podcast. This is Dan. Thanks for tuning in. Means a lot as ever. I hope this finds you well wherever you are on Spaceship Earth right now. So in this episode, I'm in conversation with Andy Cato from Wildfarmed Grain and Groove Armada. And so this was a total treat on many fronts, not just because Andy is a fascinating human, but this conversation connects up many of my own deep interests. So Andy is one half of music act Groove Armada and started his journey with music in the early 90s, at the same time that I was also beginning to DJ semi-professionally and working by day in dance music distribution, and I still have many of the vinyl promos that Andy and his Groove Armada partner Tom put out in those first few years. And so while my music career sort of plunged into insignificance, Andy and Tom went on to become massive artists as Groove Armada, releasing over 8 albums, touring all over the world, having big hits in the charts, and will next year celebrate 25 years of making music together. But Andy's story continued to evolve when he learnt about the impacts our industrial food systems were having on both planetary and human health. And that kickstarted his personal inquiry and mission into food growing, farm ownership, and his own stark experiences witnessing dying soils and the impacts industrial agriculture is having on all life. His experimental nature and curious, inquiring mind led him to the conclusion that regenerating soils for both climate and food is an urgent and pressing task for humanity. And he has been developing farming methodologies where plants, animals and soils are all working in kind of deep symbiosis and farmers, bakers, millers, retailers and customers work together to create highly nutritious grains, flours and products in a value system that works for everyone. And we cut to 2021 and his venture Wildfarmed Grain is making loads of noise and beginning to spread from the underground. So this was a really wide-ranging conversation. Andy has lived an extraordinary life, and his knowledge, energy, and dedication to building new, regenerative, and community-led food systems is incredible. And for me to have a conversation which included raving, house music, the symbiosis of plant and animal relationships, soil health, human health, climate action, and sourdough was basically an absolute treat. I mean, that's a mix for me. So let's cut to it. This is episode 49, the Spaceship Earth podcast with Andy Cato from Wildfarmed Grain. Enjoy. Right, Andy, welcome to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
Thank you very much, mate. It's lovely to be here.
Whereabouts are you on Spaceship Earth right now?
I'm about an hour southwest of Toulouse at the farm where I've been living for the last 12 years. And slightly fuzzy-headed because we had some people came walking across the farm yesterday to have a look at this agroforestry sort of edible forest thing we've got going on, which I said, yeah, crack on. I was busy. I left them to it. But afterwards, they decided to have a look at the cows who were having a drink in the stable. Or they must have been, because the people left the stable door open. So 3 o'clock this morning, I heard the sound of cow hooves on front terrace, which is never a good look. And so between 3 and 3:30 this morning, I was rounding up livestock, and then went straight from there to have a COVID vaccine. So the head's a bit fuzzy, but
wow, yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah, good combo.
Yes. So I want to dig into the farm, Andy, obviously, and the mission there. But before we do that, as is with this podcast, I'd love to, before we get into Wildfarmed Grain, explore, and obviously the amazing mission that you're on now. It'd be awesome just to sort of go back a little bit and just get a bit of that backstory, because, you've had a pretty interesting, at least from someone that's been sort of, I guess, following your work as a musician and then into what you're doing now with Wildfarmed Grain, a really interesting journey. And I know listeners are always intrigued by, I guess the threads around people's stories, which sort of lead them into the work and the pathway that they're on now. Because I first came across you, obviously, with Groove Armada, and I remember I was working, well, this is probably like mid-90s, and I was working with in a rough trade distribution, RTM, and Tim Lovely walks in with a bunch of promos with Tummy Touch, and it was one of your singles. And you've obviously gone on to spend, I guess, 20 odd years, if not more, as a really successful recording artist, and you've released like loads of music, toured all over the place, had big hits, and now obviously into the work you're doing now. And it would be amazing just to give just a little bit of that backstory, and just particularly, I guess, the things that got you to here, some of the threads and seeds maybe that emerged through that journey. Can we start with that?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it's been close on 25 years of Groove Armada. Actually, it's the 25th year next year. But I mean, it's such a sort of long span, and actually, when you go back to the beginning where I was, or the beginning of the kind of the house music bit anyway, in the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, when I was following my cousin around a fair bit, because my cousin was Diggs from DIY, the Nottingham Free Party gang.
Diggs and Whoosh.
Diggs and Whoosh, exactly. Yeah, Whoosh sadly no longer with us, but yeah. So I was following them around. It was because of my cousin Rick Diggs that I was at places like Castle Morton, the stuff of legend and all that. So then that kind of segued into ending up doing parties in what was then a derelict East London with the famous Tim Lovely, who you mentioned, and obviously my partner in crime, Tom, and it was in those apartments that are, well, at least pre-COVID, about £1 million a square foot, as far as I could see. They were just warehouses with holes in the wall, that we were taking speakers in through. So and so we were doing these parties there, and it was Tim's suggestion to say to me and Tom, why don't you take yourself off for a week, do a few tunes to promote the parties? And for reasons which are lost in the midst of time, we decided to hire a cottage in the North Yorkshire Dales. I really have no idea where that idea came from. It's pretty out there, really, as a recording destination. But we went up there, and the music we did that week became Northern Star, and
right.
And then robbed the bank, put that on the front of Music Magazine, and Zoe Ball played it on Radio 1, and one thing led to another, and really, like, before you know it, we're in Los Angeles with a guy saying, we had to get in the limo to walk to a restaurant which was 100 feet down the road. No walking. We need to arrive in style.
Amazing.
And being sort of flown into DJ gigs in a biplane and told to get out with the Biggles goggles on to make an entrance like a true Englishman into these crazy LA raves and stuff. So it was a very swift transition into a fairly surreal period.
Yeah, because I guess exactly you were right at the kind of start of this, weren't you, in terms of the whole kind of from the sort of underground scene in dance music sort of kicking off and becoming this enormous beast, and you sort of saw the whole journey, I guess. No,
we did, and it's I think the great good fortune that I had in all of that is that either with Tom, the other half, or when we started touring as a band, we took the slightly mental decision to try and play dance music live rather than do the more standard kind of synths on stage maneuver, and that's really not very good for your net return on gigs.
Yeah, right. Because of the investment required to put the show on, I guess.
Yeah, it cost a fortune, and it also took a lot of working out, to be able to make a live band sound fat enough to compete with the DJs that are before and after you. So we had some absolute horror shows trying to get that right. But when we did, we took a kind of pretty communist view of the sort of touring thing and sharing of the proceeds. But that meant that whether we were live or whether it was a DJ thing with me and Tom, I've always shared all of these experiences and the incredibly absurd situations that you find yourselves in with my best mates. And when you see a lot of DJs seem to carve a pretty lonely furrow, and it's kind of like social, these days anyway, a lot of social media feeding and, hotel rooms, gig hotel rooms and so on. And we couldn't have been further than that for us. We definitely enjoyed life to the full and made sure that wherever we were, we got into every last back alley and checked it out, and I wouldn't change that for the world.
Amazing. And I was trying to work this out. Is it 8 albums that you've released? And you put one out quite recently as well, last year, didn't you?
Oh, God. Yeah, we did one recently, yeah. A sort of kind of our tribute to the yacht rock tunes that used to soundtrack the tour bus. But yeah, I don't know, mate, to be totally honest, how many it is. It's definitely been a few, but I know that next year is year 25. And so... yeah, it's been we've had a pretty good stint at it, really.
Yeah, wow. So from 25 years of journeying through music, and now into what you're doing with Wildfarmed Grain, which we'll get into. But when people look at that, that's it feels like at least a big shift. A very big shift in direction and purpose, I guess, and mission for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what catalyzed that? What was it? How did it all begin? How did that shift start for you, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, it was actually very specific. It was coming back from a memorable gig. I say memorable. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was in an Eastern European country, and it was memorable because it was kind of like Eastern Europe's version of Burning Man, and I was DJing a long way off the ground in this kind of like scaffolding version of a Versailles palace, and the image that sticks in my mind was that in front of me there were these fairly unregulated flamethrowers, and there was a guy dressed in a kind of gold Borat suit flying a microlight alarmingly close to these licking flames, of which I think he was totally oblivious, and right over the heads of sort of 10,000 ravers. So it was pretty lawless. And behind me there was a gang of blokes with sausage dog balloons on their heads, and they were getting fully stuck into all of the evening's entertainments. And it turned out that was, which is probably just as well, I can't remember which country it was given what I'm about to say, but that was the cabinet of the country in question. Brilliant. So anyway, it was quite a surreal evening. But on the day after, I wasn't feeling particularly fresh, as you can imagine. It was a long way home, and there was a magazine on there, an English magazine, in which there was an article about industrial food production, and I just started reading it. And I was a kind of a occasional organic food buyer at the time, because I'd heard a few things about pesticides, but that was kind of it. And I just started reading this article, and I really couldn't believe what I was reading. So I started reading a bit more about it, and quite quickly got to a book on the subject, which ended with the line, "If you don't like the system, don't depend on it." And that's what got me growing vegetables.
So that was the start. So what did that look like at the start? Did you just let go? Did you let go of it, the music, or was it just sort of a gradual thing? Or what did that look like? The start of this shift.
Not at all. No. So that was very much in tandem with the music. We were kind of really at our peak at this time in terms of sort of touring schedules and everything else. So, so it just began as a vegetable patch, and by this time I was living in France simply because we had 2 kids and we wanted to live in the countryside, not in the UK. And because I was away all the time, it had to be somewhere where we knew someone, and this bit of France was where we knew someone. There's nothing more to it than that. But we were living here, and the neighbours over the hedge were full on. What we call conventional, as in kind of, fertilizer, weed killer based farmers, because they'd been sold that miracle. And these are people who'd been hungry when they were younger. And you can see why that miracle was easily sold, but we can maybe come back to that later on. But they're lovely, lovely people, totally self-reliant. And so they got me started with a vegetable patch, and it didn't get off to a brilliant start, but really, all that was required was, I just remember absolutely like it was yesterday when I sowed my first seeds, and you put these tiny little things in the potting compost, and I came back and saw that they'd sprouted, and then 6 weeks later I was eating them, this amazing food, and it was so. It sounds so simple, but it was such a transformational thing. My first thought was like, why is not this the first thing we do at school? This should be the day one at school. And from that moment on, it was just a subject that I've got deeper and deeper into. And the more you find out, the more concerning the current situation becomes.
Yeah, right. Once you've lifted the lid and had a look, it's pretty hard to let go of that. And I guess the inquiry begins. So you're starting to grow veg, and then where did the interest with wheat? How did that come about? Tell us a bit more about how this evolved, and then what got you looking, I guess, specifically into wheat production.
Well, my first experience of wheat was a particularly itchy one, because I decided to try growing some wheat old school and harvesting it with a scythe.
Oh, really?
And this because I was kind of on the sort of self-sufficiency drive at the time.
All right.
And I can tell you what, first of all, people were made of sterner stuff back then, and the people who got the real tough job were the women, because it's gathering it up into bunches. It is absolute murder, because you have to do it when it's hot and dry. Mm-hmm. So you either put a long sleeve thing on and you die of heat stroke, or you get a short sleeve thing on and your skin becomes a sea of red welts.
Oh, blimey.
So when you look at those idyllic looking photos of people doing the manual harvest, you should try it before you get too carried away with how idyllic it was. But that was just kind of a passing acquaintance with the wheat. But the wheat thing really came once I decided that the growing thing was what I wanted to do, for the rest of my life. And that once you realise how critical it is that we find new ways forward in terms of the way we farm, nothing else kind of feels particularly important. And so I took this. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, I guess I'm just saying on that, what was the revelation for you? I guess, more and more folks, they're hearing about industrial ag, they're watching programming, they're hearing about the depletion of soils, they're starting to join more dots, But, if you're really immersed in stuff, you're kind of like, exploring regenerative agriculture and all this stuff. But can you just unpack it a little bit for listeners? What are the fundamental flaws in what's become this dominant way of food production? And what was it then that particularly got you to kind of look at wheat in particular?
Yeah, well, I mean, part one of that is it's at the same time it's very complicated and very simple. But I mean, the simple response to that is that that soil is the basis of all life on Earth. It's the proper functioning soil is the only scenario under which we can have nutrient dense food, and nutrient dense food of the type that we were meant to eat, and which is fundamental to us being able to get the amino acids and micronutrients absolutely essential to the proper functioning of our bodies. And the public health crisis that we're faced with is a reflection of the fact that has all gone wrong, and that's gone wrong actually due to things which to a certain degree at the very beginning were done with the best of intentions. And it was people, scientists looking at people who were really struggling to sustain themselves because actually the soil had already been heavily degraded through cultivation, because every time we disturb soil we let in oxygen, and so carbon, which is the soil's fertility, becomes CO2 and becomes a problem rather than a solution. And so in response to seeing people suffering, came up with the idea that we could synthesize the main ingredients of plant nutrition and make fertilizers to do that. And that was combined with the fact that after World War II, there was loads of oil kicking around, which was required for this process to work. And bingo, and initially it does look miraculous. But unfortunately, the long-term consequences of effectively bypassing and killing off the soil food web are profound. And we're seeing those today, both in terms of public health, in terms of huge ecological declines, and of course in the fact that a third, if not more, of all man-made CO2 has come from the soil, which should be and could be again a huge carbon sink. So we've got ourselves in a pretty dire set of circumstances, and yet actually the speed at which nature comes back still, having seen that at first hand, if you give it half a chance, is amazing and a source of great hope.
Yeah, and I guess there's also, as a sort of global species, we've become massively dependent on, a handful of grains as well, right? With wheat being one of them.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that we've gone from eating, I think that, what is it, they I can't remember how many noughts, whether it was 5,000 or 50,000, but the number of plant remains found in amongst our nomadic ancestors is just absolutely vast. And as you say, I think it's something like 85% or even higher than that of products in the supermarket are made from five ingredients, which is in itself something that needs sorting out.
Yeah, totally. I guess the soil is, on one hand, obviously, she said it's where life is. It's where it happens, and it's funny. I've been chatting recently to the writer Jay Griffiths about this, and she writes a lot about our relationship to soil and just how we've talked. How we talk the language of soil, if you like, the way we've talked about it specifically in the last few hundred years, is something that's below us almost. It's almost like it's because it's it's below our feet. It's almost in many ways there's a sense that it's we've disconnected ourselves from that which is where life is created. It's where it happens. No soil, no life. But there's some sort of perception of it almost that it's like we tend to look at things maybe as like dirt, and obviously that's shifting, right? We're seeing this conversation around soil and soil health and human health. It's kind of coming, but it's such an interesting time, isn't it? Because you've got that dynamic of this is where life happens, and then you've got what it is that we're putting into ourselves. Not just how we've been treating the soil, but obviously like you say, the processes and the interventions and the chemicals and all the things that we've been kind of throwing into the mix as well. The destruction of the soil in many ways is being mirrored by the breakdown of human health and physical health and all these things that are coming from because I sort of geeked out about this in my own experiences, getting into bread, by making bread, and was just horrified again, what is such a simple, beautiful thing that's sort of been bastardized through industrial processes. So yeah, I don't know. I'm on a bit of a ramble here, but it's interesting that there are these two elements, to what you're looking at here, and the sort of health of the sort of non-human ecosystems, but then obviously, the health of the human that's intimately connected to it through what is what it is that we're cultivating and feeding ourselves with.
Yeah, well, I mean, just as what you just saying there made me think about. There's an amazing guy called Albert Howard who was writing about 150, 160 years ago now. And if anyone's going to read one book about what we're talking about, I always recommend his book, An Agricultural Testament. Mm-hmm. Extraordinary man. But I won't go into all the ins and outs of it. I just recommend that anyone reads it. It's a fascinating book. But one thing that he mentions in there, which you reminded me of, was that we've known about this for so long, because he did a study of the 1930s, or pre-World War II, what do you call it, draft, when soldiers were signed up for the army, and they had to go through all these fitness and health tests. And then he did a graph, it's in the book actually, where he correlates their health and outcomes or analysis. Mm-hmm. And then he makes a graph between that and the state of the soils in the regions that they came from. And obviously bear in mind then food supplies were a little more localized. So sure. The people were eating, products largely from closer to home. Mm-hmm. And when you put the two things on a graph, it's parallel lines, which is absolutely fascinating. And more recently, of course, when you look at the moment from which there's been a widespread use of glyphosate, mm-hmm. And the impact that has on the shitty mark pathway in plants, which is what allows them to make the amino acids that we can't make ourselves and that we need from plants to build all of our proteins. And you look at the widespread use of that and compare it to various things from for autism to Parkinson's to dementia and various cancers and stuff, and there's a very persuasive line on that graph too. So it's kind of unsurprising that our bodies evolved in symbiosis with plants and animals, all in turn involved in symbiosis with this life force, which is the soil. And when that breaks down, we're part of that system. And so when we declare war on that system, we declare war on ourselves.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, that sounds like a must read. I'll link to that in the in the show notes as well. So I guess there's sort of multiple ways you're becoming aware of this kind of what the impacts are now of years of this sort of industrialized way of thinking about food production and the relationship to farming and soils, and there's sort of multiple ways that you can explore this. So yeah, for you it's been wheat and a way of farming and a way of approaching this. So yeah, I guess how'd that become the thing for you?
Well, actually, the first thing that happened was after doing vegetables for a few years and getting to the point of selling them in the local market, and then deciding that I wanted to take the plunge, doing this retrospectively absolutely insane decision to sell my publishing rights and use that to guarantee a loan to buy a farm in France. What happened after I did that was catastrophic. Everything went wrong. I was totally overwhelmed by the amount of information to take on board, the fact that I'm not a mechanic, and a lot of farming's about being a mechanic. I mean, it was a tsunami wave of information, from grain cleaners to silos to tractor engines to irrigation systems. It was horrific, and lots of people circling around me saying, if you don't plow, you're going to lose control of the fields to the weeds. If you go organic, you're mad. You need to use herbicides, all this stuff. Anyway, what happened was that I'd actually bought a farm with soil that was been totally destroyed. After 80 years of maize production, it had 0.5% organic matter. A good percentage would be around sort of 5 or 6, and anything under 1% is considered to be non-functional. And so
you bought a non-functional farm.
Yeah, but bet the family silver on a non-functional farm. Nice one. And so what happened when I started trying to grow organically in that system is that what nature kept doing was sending out the plants that it requires to save the day. These are ones that can grow in really low fertility situations and begin a re-establishment of fertility, which ultimately, if you left it to its own devices, would culminate in a forest, in most places in Europe anyway. And those plants are things like dock leaves and thistles, which of course is what everyone wants to get rid of. So you just get trapped in this horrific loop where you're trying to get rid of these dock leaves and thistles and similarly invasive plants. But every time you cultivate to try and do that, you're losing what little organic matter you've got left, and destroying the soil even more. And so nature's response is to send even more of them out there, and I was under a lot of financial pressure, and I just kind of hit the buffers. It was a terrible, terrible time. And it was actually just at the point where I was about to have to accept defeat and try and sell it to someone that I came across this Albert Howard book. And that just changed the lens completely. And having read that, I said to my poor and long-suffering wife, look, I know we're kind of in the shit here, but before I give up, I want to try it like Albert says. And the first tenet of successful farming for him is you've got to have plants and animals together. That's what nature does. And when you separate them, you take one beautiful solution and you create two problems. And so last throw of the dice was to get in a herd of cows and sow a lot of the fields down to diverse pastures full of 40, 50 different species, and start mob grazing. Mob grazing is when you kind of copy the movement of the old herds that used to cross the plains before we arrived. So you get short bursts of very intensive grazing, and
then they move on, right? It's like a stimulation as well, sort of, because you're talking about a sort of symbiosis, right? That's what's going on, isn't it? It's a sort of deep, complex relationship between the animals and
very deep, complex relationship, and they evolve together. Grass and grass eaters evolve together, and that relationship is what led to the fact that when you look at the great agricultural soils that have sustained us over the last few centuries, that thick black earth that was there when we first turned it over was created by the grazing impacts of these big herds of herbivores. And if you start doing that again, but I have to specify that it's that specific type of grazing, and overgrazing can be very destructive, of course. But that specific type of grazing, the effects of it and the speed of the effects of it are amazing. And so, having put that in place, whilst at the same time pursuing other experiments on other bits of the farm, I got to a point where there's a fork in the road, basically, and from the moment that you say we've got a problem here with these farm chemicals or soil erosion or whatever, either you turn left and you say we must stop touching the soil, and so we're going to go to a kind of no-till farming where we don't disturb the soil, but that is generally based on glyphosate to deal with the weeds, and that's what allows you to not disturb the soil. And glyphosate, for the reasons we talked about before, for me was a no-no. Or you turn right and say, we've got to stop using these chemicals. We've got to go organic. But a lot of organic farming tends to be based around a lot of soil cultivation. So you get rid of the pesticides and the fungicides and herbicides, which is great. But you're in danger if you're not careful of doing excessive soil cultivation and exacerbating the soil problem. And so the question I was faced with is, what's in between those two things? How can we do the best of both worlds? And having seen the impact of the cows and the pastures, I was in the old sort of better end of organic agriculture. You'd have a pasture for 4 or 5 years. You'd then plough it, do 2 or 3 years of cereals to make the use of all that good stuff you built up, and then put it back down to pasture again. But when I had these pastures going and saw how quickly things were changing, I was just desperate not to do that. I just really didn't want to turn it all upside down again. And that's what led me on this kind of obsessional quest to find out how we could combine annual grains with perennial pastures.
Yeah, so you were talking about kind of speed of recovery, or how quickly nature can respond to that, bringing back, like you say, the cattle, but obviously working on this mob grazing logic. But can you give us a sense of sort of, what does that actually look like in time? Because you went from, like you said, you're sort of, it looked like the farm. It sounds like you're on your knees almost. So how quickly did you start to see that? And, what did that look like?
It's remarkable. I mean, because I was definitely on my knees. In fact, the low point was when I had this crop of soybeans going, and soybean seed is expensive, and I had to harvest this crop of soybeans because I was really, as you said, on my knees. And there's a type of weed called datura down here, Datura, and it's highly toxic. And if you get any of that in your soybean beans, it can't be sold for human food, and so it halves its price basically.
Right.
So I saw these weeds starting to come through, and basically, like any weed, they're just an indicator that things are out of whack, which they definitely were at my farm. And so I saw one of them, and I went and pulled it up, and then the next day there was 10. I pulled them up. Then there was 100, and then there was 1,000, and then they were just all over the field. This plague. Yeah. And so I said to the neighbour, like, what do I do about this? And he said, you need to speak to so-and-so up the road on the hill there. He's got this gadget. And basically his gadget was, if you imagine 5 Flymo blades, exposed blades on a bar in front of the tractor. And the idea is that you drive through your crop higher than the soybeans, but cutting off the tops of these datura weeds, the idea being that they don't set seed.
Yeah. Bonkers.
And so if you imagine like 35 degrees, you've got 5 Flymos on the go, goggles on, and they kind of got to keep your mouth shut because there's debris going everywhere. And it's noisy as hell, and it's just a sort of dust bowl, and it's just horrific. I did a couple of hours of it and then just realised the total futility of what I was doing, because the response of any plant, if you cut the flowers off, is it'll make some more, maybe slightly fewer. And just sort of came back to this thing that I've been reading Albert Howard. There's like, there are any number of seeds of different plants, call them weeds or whatever, at any one time. And what you need to do is create conditions in which they don't need to grow, which sounds kind of utopian. But going back to, this is the answer to your question, is that there was a field that was literally back-to-back thistles because they just spread and spread and spread. And a big field, like 10 football pitches. And I sowed that down to pasture as best as I could amongst the thistles, and some of it got away, some of it didn't. But enough of it got away for me to start grazing it. And within a couple of passes, a year later, I stood in that field and there wasn't one visible thistle. And that's kind of amazing. And then so you realise...
So what's going on there? Like, what's behind that? How does that happen? What's happened there?
Well, what's happened there is that the different plants in that pasture have done different things. So the legume plants will have fixed nitrogen from the air and put it in the soil, so increased available nitrogen, which then allows other plants and grasses to flourish, and then start decompacting the soil and opening that up and feeding the soil bacteria, and just basically starting on all of that, helped by the bacterial life brought by the grazing of the cows. And so you're very quickly, it's like putting your starter levain in your dough. You very quickly start to recolonize the bacterial and fungal life. And as soon as you do that, you're moving the conditions up a notch on the dial to the point where thistles aren't needed anymore, because those real critical low fertility, let's try and save our skin settings are no longer the case. And it's just to see that theoretical idea or actual idea, as I realised, become reality so fast at such scale. It literally brought me to tears. I mean, it's an amazing thing, and actually goes back to what I was saying before. Gives me source of huge optimism in all this, because actually there's so many gains to be had on degraded soils. That is the one upside of our predicament.
Wow. Yeah, my head's trying to. I've got to the thistles, and I'm thinking, why have they stopped appearing? Like, what's happening? Where the thistle is no longer able to spread and find its way into this. Is it because the conditions have shifted?
Yeah, well, I think I don't know the exact mechanism, but in the same way that you will see clumps of nettles, for example, in very particular places.
Yeah, I've got them in my garden.
Yeah, and that's
all in the same place.
Yeah, and that's because of the soil conditions in that spot, and so there's a process going on whereby the seeds or rootstock or whatever it is of particular plants are monitoring the situation. In a chemical fashion, obviously, and they go when it's their time to go.
Amazing.
You can see that. I mean, dockleaves is another great example. Well, any of these plants is going through the same process, this sort of watching and waiting process. And I don't know exactly how that works, but this is a thing that comes up again and again. In that, well, there's an American soil scientist lady, can't remember her name, but she was saying last week that 10 years ago she thought she knew how 1% of soil life worked. And after 10 years of better and better techniques and microscopes, she now thinks she might know how 1/10 of 1% works.
Love it.
Which that's kind of all you need to know, really. And the thing is that we don't know how all this stuff. It's operating on a level of complexity which is just breathtaking. But what we do know is, which is pretty simple, is what all of this stuff in the soil needs in order to function in its beautiful completeness, and that's air, water, shelter, and food, same as us. And so rather than getting kind of obsessed with breaking everything down in our reductionist way to saying it's A and B and therefore that must be C, just like that, we don't know what's going on here, but we do know how to make it work well. So let's do that.
Yeah, love that. It's like, we're just moving into service. We're creating the conditions, and we're trusting the complexity and all that, intelligence, and saying, we know what supports this ability to flourish, and we know what impacts that ability to do that. Love it. I love the not knowing element. Again, it's really sort of countercultural to the sort of command and control logic that we've been sort of brought up with over, the last few decades. There's something really interesting about, that sort of humbleness of not knowing.
I think humbleness is the
Love
word,
that.
and it's something that we're not very good at, and something that going out of the sort of pomp and circumstance of, you know, DJ poos and all the rest of it, to being in the middle of these inexplicably beautiful and mysterious processes is a really humbling thing.
Wow, amazing. So this marks the shift then, and so tell us about that. What was the birth then of Wildfarmed Grains? Let's get into that. You know, you've gone from this kind of pretty traumatic reality of what you've invested in, you know, this farm and the reality of the land and the soil and what was going on for you, and then you had these breakthroughs, it seems. And so yeah, how did things evolve from there? Where did this mission really cement itself?
Yeah, well, the evolution towards the grain thing, it came from that sort of standing in front of these pastures which had worked such wonders, and thinking like, well, I need to harvest some grains here, but how can I do that without turning this all upside down? And one of the great stumbling blocks that we're faced with when you're trying to do systems of farming in which you let natural systems run their course is that the vast majority of varieties of cereals, vegetables, whatever, that we have available now are ones that have been adapted to flourish when they're fed with chemicals and propped up with pesticides. And we've got very few varieties which are actually retain their original genetics of being able to compete, because ultimately all these were wildflowers at one point, and they could just get on with it and compete like the wildflowers that we see today. And one field where that's less the case, thanks to, there's a guy down here called Jean-Francois Berthelot, and there's a guy, his English equivalent is a guy called John Letts, Andrew Forbes, lots of people in different countries around the world who have taken it upon themselves to multiply and preserve these old grain varieties, which have this competitive capacity. So from my start, my sort of move towards wheat was because that was what seemed to be the most promising area in which there might be varieties competitive enough to kind of get away with basically whacking them into grass and hoping for the best, which is where I started, because I was saying to some kids who came to the farm on a farm visit, these old wheats, they were found by mankind growing in the pastures of the Fertile Crescent and selected because of their nice, tasty big seeds. And after saying that, I was thinking, well, hang on, if they grew in pastures then, can they grow in pastures now? And so that led to a whole load of experiments, which I won't bore you with the details because there were far more failures than successes, but eventually got to a system where this combination of annual crops in perennial pastures was working. And then was struck by the next problem, which is that the only measure of success in farming, mainstream farming, is by weight. It's quite shocking when you come into the agricultural world from the outside, is that no one's talking about nutritional
weight of yield.
Yeah. How many tons? Not what's in it, but just how many tons have you got of it? And so if you're doing a system where you're making things that are nutrient dense, but there's less of it, you can't make a living by selling that into the existing system. So you're forced down a road of adding value, which in the first instance, I thought, well, I'll sell flour. And then when no one wanted to buy the flour, I started making bread. Yeah. Well, I'll stop there because then the wild farm thing is kind of after that, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. It's opening up all kinds of things for me. Have you read the One Straw Revolution? Have you read that?
Brilliant, but that was one of my early inspirations.
Yeah, because as you were talking, it was making me think a little bit of that as well. It's kind of spirit, I guess, of how we're sort of looking at the land, I guess, and our relationship to it. And it seems to me, again, anyway, sort of like this idea of resisting. It's probably simplifying things here a bit, but it almost feels to me like the One Straw Revolution. A lot of my takeout was resisting the urge to meddle and make interventions, and to really try and trust these natural processes.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. He's also a guy who was a crop researcher, realised the futility of reductionist thinking when you apply that to such a complex, unfathomable system. So he was like studying a particular fungus on a particular wheat variety, and realised that looking at that in isolation is just ludicrous, really. And he applied that principle, as you say, of not meddling with enormous courage when he went back to his father's farm. And he was actually doing a version of the same thing. He was growing rice and wheat into a permanent crop of clover. The one thing that he had on his side, which is significant, is that because it was an old rice paddy, once a year he could flood it, and that did allow him to keep a check on weeds. Well, I hesitate to call them weeds, but plants that we don't want there at that time, we should probably say.
Yeah. Well, we'll dive into the bread in a sec, but again, just for listeners, give us a sense. So this method, like just a simple sense, because I think people have this image of wheat production, and they imagine, fields being ploughed and furrowed, and wheat being planted, and this method you're speaking to, like you say, you're cultivating within lots of other plants, right? And you're seeding this wheat within meadows, almost, I guess. So tell us a little bit about that, and then you're bringing animals in to move across the land as well, and I'm just trying to give people a little bit of a sense of what it looks like and how it kind of works. Yeah,
well, that way it's exactly what you said. So if you imagine that you've got a nice diverse meadow or pasture with lots of things going on in it, and what you would do is use your animals to graze all that down really tight sometime in the autumn. And then I've tried various different methods, but the fundamental principle is that you create little slots within that into which you can sow your wheat seeds, which, because it's a time of year when all those pasture plants are kind of coming to the end of their cycle, the wheat can quite easily get the jump at that stage over its competition and get the roots down and get itself sorted. And then after that, it's just simply kind of remembering that that wheat is a grass, and so you can treat it like other grasses. So up to a point, which is the point where, because what happens is the earing wheat begins underground and comes up through the stalk until eventually it becomes visible. And there's up until the point where it's about an inch off the ground. Inside the stalk, you can't see it, but it's in there. If you open it up with a razor blade, you can see it. But up until that point, you can eat the wheat, you can graze the wheat down, or you could even mow it down if you wanted to. But and the wheat will just come back, just like grass does. And so what that means is that you can. And again, there's nothing new in this. Actually, we systematically grazed winter cereals in the past because it makes them tiller, which in other words makes them spread out a bit more and make more grain heads, and it also means that the leaves are less susceptible to getting any disease during the winter months because they're not there. So there's nothing new in this, but if you time it right, then with these older varieties in the spring, if you graze it one last time just before it's that critical moment when you can't do it anymore, then because the wheat is an annual plant and these older wheats grow very tall, it just gets up above the grass and beats it. And so at its when I was doing it in France initially, that's how it was working. And then as we've adapted it now to be for broad acre kind of big cereal farms, we've actually got a slightly different method where we use mini mowers to mow the grass between the wheat rows, just to give a bit of extra security about controlling the understory of grass pre-harvest.
Amazing. So going to this quality quantity piece, because like you're saying, it seems like you're saying that this whole question of yield and how do you create, I guess, a business model around what you're doing. So is there a sense that you then got into actually like creating products? Is that where the thing came from, this sort of breakthrough?
Yeah, well, in France it was very organic, no pun intended, evolution. But yes, I made the flour, but locally I wasn't able to sell that because there is less gluten in some of these older varieties, and so it didn't. You need to make bread in a slightly different way. It's not particularly hard; it just needs to be done slightly differently. So I was forced into making bread, and then to sell the bread into shops which already had bread suppliers, of course, I was obliged to explain why people should eat this one, and that got me into communicating about soil and how all nutrition begins there, and all the kinds of things we've been talking about. And that went quite well. It took a while, but we ended up with people taking over from me on the baking front, and we ended up supplying lots of the local schools, and then we ended up with a farm shop in the local town, and all based around a lot of communication about the things that I'd discovered on this journey. Yeah. But then the wild farm thing was when my friends Ed, George, and others came over, and I would just tell them about the stuff I was finding out about, and how we could change so many things if we change the way that we treat our soils. By talking to them about it, it became clear that it seemed to me, at least in my experience, that there was two big breaks that were going to hold us back, and one was on a farming side, where, speaking from my local experience here, farmers are operating in very, very tough conditions because they're in a downward death spiral in terms of soil health. They're often quite indebted. They're under enormous cultural pressure to do things as they've been done. They're under enormous commercial pressure from people coming to sell them all the bits, chemicals and seeds and this and that and the other. And if we expect those people en masse to, on top of all the shit they've got to deal with already, totally turn their preconceived ideas on their head, take a huge amount of risk, buy a whole new set of gear, and then set up a bakery, it's never going to happen. So we need to be able to say to farmers, at least in the first instance, here's a simple, tested method of switching to a different way of growing things, and we can help you with the gear, and we can help you get it going. And crucially, we will pay you a good enough price for your wheat that even though you're going to grow less of it, you're going to make far more money doing this than doing what you're doing now. And that's crucial. But that can only work, and this is the other bit of what we kind of realize collectively, that can only work if, on the other hand, we go and explain to consumers everything that we're talking about, and saying, look, if you're worried about ecological meltdown and climate change and all the rest of it, and you're worried that you can't do anything about it, well, actually you can, because if you buy food that come from these carbon positive, ecologically positive farming systems, you've become an activist. And so this loaf might cost 10p more, but here's why. And by choosing this loaf, you've now become part of the solution. So it's a really nice, empowering message. And by joining those two things up, the hope is that we can sort of drive change pretty fast, because we need to do things pretty fast from where we are at the moment.
We live on a life-giving rock called Earth, hurtling through space. How bonkers is that? You're listening to the Spaceship Earth podcast.
This system that you're sort of talking about is super interesting, and when you look at Wildfarmed Grain and the way that you're talking about what you're doing, it's very clear that you're talking about a sort of collective. At least that's how it's coming across. It feels like your work is speaking to millers and bakers and retailers and customers, and it feels like that's quite key to what you're trying to do. And can you tell us a bit about that, and how's that been shaping up? What's that like? You've intentionally been trying to cultivate that by the looks of things.
Yeah, I think because, the version of sort of a regenerative future, if you like, that I got going down here, we ended up with 8 people being employed on a 100-hectare farm, which would usually employ about 0.7 of a person in a conventional setting. So it's been a hugely positive thing, but I just think that given the required speed of change that's required, we can't wait for this for our countryside to get refashioned into a series of little farms doing things like this, because however much we might complain about it, the societal structures and a whole load of things about the way things are set up, from ownership to whatever, and that's a legitimate discussion, but right now we are where we are. So we need something that works within the existing setup, because we haven't got any time left. And so that means that in order to have ecological regeneration and after we've regenerated sustainability, we need to have financial stability. So we can only do this thing if we can build up an ecosystem, is a nice word for it, of people who are all getting properly paid for the work that they're doing. And we're making sure that anyone who isn't contributing proper work to this field to plate chain is not in this value chain anymore, because that's what means that the farmer gets properly paid, the miller gets properly paid, everyone gets properly paid, and the consumer can participate in this without having to pay stupid money for a loaf of bread, And so we need to build the ecosystem for 2 reasons. One, is so that we can get the right participants to build this field to plate chain in a really efficient way, so that we can operate in a way where this is not food for the rich. This is an everyman's choice. And we also need to build an ecosystem, because there's a large piece of education that needs to go on there, not in a patronizing way. I knew nothing about all this stuff, and why would most people know anything about all this stuff? It's coming, as you say, it's coming, but there's a lot that needs to be explained, and I think that in the midst of all this anxiety and worry, there's a need to touch as many people as we can to communicate the message, which is you can be part of the solution from tomorrow, because ultimately power rests with the people who buy things, and those 3 times a day when you feed yourselves are 3 times a day where you can push things in the right direction. And that, it's a great message of hope, but we need to communicate that, and we need as many people on board to do that as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I mean, I think generally, people want to do the right thing, but these systems that have been built around us have removed most of us, massively from how food is cultivated, the relationship, as you've explained, and all that stuff you've been discovering is very far away from most folks. I mean, that's how that's how food is grown, but then it's how it's distributed and marketed, and all those. In many ways, we've been quite separated from all that industrial process. And there's something I think so interesting about this, which is also, like you say, it's not a banging people over the head education. It's a kind of involving people in these new systems. And through that, everyone is kind of learning and is able then to make better decisions, not just for their own health and families and communities, but also, for this extraordinary living world that's essential for all our future. So something really interesting, I think, about this, where you're looking at it, because again, it sort of goes against, I'm guessing, to have these different parts of the system sort of working together. And you talk a little bit as well about, it's fascinating to me, I've been sort of geeking out on sourdough probably about 10 years. I've been trying to sort of practice my own baking, and I'm fascinated with bread and always have been. And I became type 1 diabetic actually about 20 odd years ago, and that was like a big shift for me in trying to understand what was going into me and all that kind of stuff, and got really into bread, and I'm still always learning every time trying to make the stuff. But I guess I was also really fascinated by flour, and also the fact that my understanding again that good organic flour cultivated in these ways, but also how it was milled, like what was left in it. There is this extraordinary nutrition in wheat when it hasn't really been meddled with through the milling process as well. That's right, yeah. And of course, in modern bread production, at least in my understanding, so much of that goodness and nutrition has been stripped out. You know, the milling piece is pretty key as well, right? As far as I can tell,
it is absolutely key. And I mean, it's funny that, you know, a lot of food talk. Like if people talk about organic foods, the conversation tends to be around, well, it hasn't got pesticides or herbicides. We talk an awful lot about what isn't in our food, and we need to talk a lot more about what is or should be. And part of that, of course, is the functioning soil web, and part of it, as you say, in the case of wheat, a massive part of it is the milling process. For the simple reason that when you take wheat grains or any cereal grain and grind them between two stones, you keep all elements of the grain in there, and even if you filter out a little bit of the coarser bran to have a slightly whiter flour or more open crumb in your bread or whatever, you've nevertheless got all of the elements of the grain in there, including the germ, which is where all the essential oils are. And when we switched to industrial roller milling, which was a sort of faster and in financial terms, a more efficient process, one of the consequences of that was that the germ gets separated out, and so and was actually, I think, sold off for animal feed, ironically, because by doing that means that the flour will never go off, and so that's the flour that I grew up on, where, you know, mum makes a cake, puts it back in the cupboard, and 6 months later you make another cake, and it hasn't moved or been touched, you know, partly because I think any sort of local mice would have understood that they're nutritionally better off eating the packet than they are eating the flour.
Brilliant. Yeah, but that's nuts, isn't it? I mean, again, as you know, as I say, that's been my thing, and in actually good bread, you know, and you know, I've been a ship to mill fan for years, although, you know, obviously now switched to Wildfarmed Grain, obviously, but you know, what I've also discovered is just as a real staple diet, just how good everything from gut health to physical health to all kinds of stuff from eating, you know, effectively just a very good, simple product that's being produced with the wholeness of the ingredient, and just how, you know, how transformative that's been, you know, which is mad. You know, you think, you know, it's such a simple thing, bread, right, in its form, but it can actually deliver so much of what's needed. But, you know, that's been, at least, you know, my sort of sense is that so much of that has been lost in these industrial processes and ways of creating things for speed and efficiency, you know. And I still have, you know, peers and friends who you get quite sort of astounded by the nutritional quality of, you know, bread that's been made with, you know, flours like this, you know.
It is. I mean, it's a superfood if it's done right, you know, and if you've got good grains, well milled and well fermented, it's a superfood, and it wasn't chosen as the staff of life by chance, you know. And
right.
If you think that, you know, what happened for most of bread's life is that you would take your grains to the local mill when you had your slot, and you would go straight from there to use the village bread oven. So you basically had freshly milled, nutritionally sparkling flour that would then be fermented and cooked straight away. And I think you could probably do a very, very indicative experiment when you think that, you know, prisoners back in the day, obviously I'm not saying they were having a laugh or anything, but they were on bread and water, and they were on bread and water for months, and they stayed alive. And I think if you try to repeat that experiment with a supermarket loaf, I don't think it lasts very long.
Yeah, right. It's extraordinary. And well, I mean, obviously, you know, you've now got the farm in France, but you're now working with different folks using this approach, the Wildfarmed Grain method, in lots of other places now, right, including England. Can you Can you just tell us a bit about that? How is that unfolding? Where are you? What's that been like, working with different folks and bringing this approach into it?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it's been a total whirlwind because on the one hand, I've been going around seeing lots of farmers, which has been a great privilege and fascinating conversations with people, and that's been really interesting, the sheer range of conversations. But overall, having a message which is that we've set up this thing which rewards you for the quality of the soil and ecosystems in which you grow things. So instead of chasing every last ton, you can move the dial now and start growing in a way which produces nutrient dense food. That's that creation of that value chain has been a real kind of source of inspiration to lots of people that I've met, and it's obviously been a great privilege for me to be the person who's brought that message. So that I've had lots of conversations with farmers, which have been great, and so many people have great ideas as to different ways to get to the same objective that we're trying to get to. And I was thinking, I was going to build this or that piece of equipment to do a version of what you're saying, but I didn't bother doing it because the wheat that came out of that system wasn't going to be worth any more than any other system. So there's no point, and now there is. So there's all these very inspirational conversations going on with lots of other farmers. At the same time, much more in hope than expectation, I applied for a national trust farm because it was increasingly clear that I needed to be in the UK and in the heart of all this incredible sort of goodwill and movement that's happening. And to my absolute astonishment, in what was a fairly competitive race, I was the one that was plucked out of the hat. So we're now kind of trying to work out how we move back from France and deal with all the family implications of coming back to the UK to take over this national trust farm. And
where's that? Where's that going to be?
It's down. It's in Warwickshire, but it's kind of just underneath the Cotswolds, heading towards Swindon. Okay. So pretty well placed for people to come.
Not far from me. I shall come and visit.
Well, there you go, mate. Your flower supplies are sorted.
It's getting closer. It's getting more and more local.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'd love to know a bit more about, what is, just as a question, you're talking about these other farmers. I'm curious about what is it that's, maybe it's many things, but what are other farmers and landowners when they're reaching out, or when you're connecting with them? What's sort of piquing their curiosity? What are the things that are driving their desire to look at this methodology?
It depends. Some people are a long way down the road, and been farming far longer than I have, and have gone through similar processes and come to a similar conclusion that actually this constant living understory plants, in my case, diverse pastures, some people are working with clovers or whatever, is kind of the holy grail. And I've been trying all kinds of things to get to that point, and just needed this sort of value chain to motivate them to push it to the end. Mm-hmm. But other conversations, probably more frequent, are people, because there's an awful lot of chat about regenerative farming now. Mm-hmm. It's all over the place, and a lot of it, when you start it, people start talking about, you got to put cover crops in there with lots of different species of cover crops, that you need to do bi-cropping. In other words, rather than growing wheat, you grow wheat and beans together, for example, that you need more crops in your rotation. So start growing like buckwheat or lentils or whatever it is. Basically, diversity is the thing. And from someone who's been maybe doing like rapeseed and wheat for years and years, that's quite intimidating, and there's a lot to get your head around, and there's a lot of very expensive seed and all kinds of stuff to sort out there, and so in our method we can say, well, look, all the diversity piece, we're going to tick that box with these permanent perennial pasture strips, and alongside that we can then concentrate on cultivating, wheat, oats, and peas or something, something which feels much more accessible. So on that end of the spectrum, it's just trying to do what the wild farm thing on the farming side is all about. Say, look, we can help you take this step into a regenerative future in a way which is easy, and which doesn't require a load of capital outlay, and hopefully through that speed up the process a bit.
Yeah, and you mentioned things like buckwheat, and I've been getting really into buckwheat and millet this year for for porridge. I was saying I'm a diabetic, and it's quite interesting. I've been looking at different plant fats and what they do to blood sugars, and even high fat content in plant grains can have an impact on insulin, can actually make insulin not as effective. So I've been looking at things like millet and buckwheat. They're amazing. You can make these amazing porridges out of at least I found them, compared to oats. Not that I've got a problem with oats, but it's just that there's more fat content in oats, and I was looking at where these grains are coming from. The ones I've been buying all seem to be grown in Holland, but it feels like, again, that these other grains, and again, I guess it's that point of diversity. We probably need way more diversity in terms of the grains and the plants that we're consuming. But it's interesting that there are these combinations that that you're speaking to, and it feels, again, in my sense, that people are sort of, I don't know, I think there's much more possibility that in widening what we cultivate and eat. We've had almost a sort of a monoculture. Even when you look at something like porridge, we've always been told, it's oats.
Yeah.
Actually, there's all these other amazing grains that can also do exactly what you need and what you're looking for. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting time, just from a diet perspective as well. I think sort of folks, I think many folks are waking up, I guess, to trying other things, and I guess also you're coming to the UK now, but again, one thing I'm always thinking about is how do we create more food security? I mean, I grow vegetables, right, but like nothing like at the scale that you would have grown them. But I grow veg, every year, and like the last couple of months, the weather has been so crazy and difficult to grow, and you just think, God, my patch is looking, compared to what it should be like at the moment, it's like all over the shop. And so I guess it makes me jump to not just to like food security, and how do we build these more resilient food systems, and where we're eating things that are actually made for these lands, I guess. And so you sensing and seeing these sort of developments from farmers as well right now that you're talking to them?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it feels like a bit like dance music post Castle Morton. There's a very significant underground going on, and nice. And that will break through for sure. And I think it's in terms of what you're saying about all the lovely sort of diversity of diet that we've lost, and some of which, when I get time, I sort of try and get back through foraging and stuff. But it's about finding ways, within the wild farm system. Obviously, trees and putting trees back and hedges back is kind of that's a given. But beyond that, and then he sort of occasionally run up against sometimes practical but mainly bureaucratic barriers. But it's about there's so much space in a farm system, and so many niche opportunities for significant amounts of leaves and vegetables and nuts and fruits and all kinds of stuff, and it's just making that work in a way which is doable, practical, and unfortunately that passes muster with all the innumerable rules and regulations that surround our fields.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting as well. I love that sort of the underground farming movement, because it does feel like there's a lot of experimenting going on, and also I guess younger generations as well that are looking to the land. And I guess that's a big question of access. How do we open up more space for more experimentation? Maybe to be going on within this diversity, because I guess you've got like you say, conventional farmers who who've maybe been farming their entire lives, and I guess there's a lot of it's quite a big step as well to step into this more unknown way of doing things, but then you've also got these younger generations, right, coming through, and I guess who haven't got any of this kind of ingrained behavior or this old system. So it's also like, how do we create diversity, I guess, in who can actually access the land and start to grow this whole movement?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that's something that, like, certainly George, one of my partners in Wildfarmed Grain, he's tackling the whole school thing. So he's set up a thing called Grow, which is operating at, for the moment, at an academy in Tottenham.
Oh yeah, North London.
And he's just doing amazing things. Just getting all the food in the canteen. The kids are growing it themselves, but it's also a very holistic thing, because, as all these things are linked. So he's getting to do some mindfulness and some physical activity, and observing of nature and all this. And I think that through things that it feels that stuff is being at least talked about and started to happen in a way which just didn't exist relatively few years ago. And I think we've got to hope that one of the positive sides of the technology which surrounds us, I think, is the possibility for exponential change. And we just need to make sure the next one, the graph goes off in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing, isn't it? There's this sort of narrative of jobs, and things, but actually, because we've been on this sort of efficiency, technology, man dominates nature, controlling story for however many 100 years, and we've reached the pinnacle of it, and it's all starting to collapse. But there's this idea of like, well, actually, so many people could go back or onto the land, or for the first time onto the land, and I guess it also feels like this method requires, or to scale it would require way more people on the land. But like you say, not necessarily having to have, access to huge kind of plots, but actually being able to cultivate, smaller things and more diverse. So you're bringing different types of skill sets into play. But, there could be this extraordinary way of more people, finding a purpose, I guess, which also in many ways can start to tackle all these things that you're saying, like George is looking at, whether it's mental health or connection to community. There's so much possibility, I think, through these kinds of approaches, which are, often not, again, the narrative will say, oh, we've got to give people jobs, we've got to keep growing these things. But actually there is this thing, isn't it? It's a bit like that sort of cathedral thinking. You know what I mean? It's like, if we're going to build these new types of systems, it's actually going to require loads of people and less machines. It's more about, do we value this? Do we actually decide that's what we want to be doing as a culture?
Exactly. And I think that sense of purpose is key, and it's kind of quite an interesting thing, that comes up with some of the older kids who come to the farm here, and I do a little slideshow to show pictures of my trials and tribulations and over the years, and I start off with a slide from a gig we did on the other stage on Glastonbury, the closing slot on a Sunday, and we had so many lasers that the pilots landing at Heathrow sent a message to Glastonbury telling us to turn the lasers down. So it's a great picture, and it's all going off. That one. Yeah, it's all going off, but it's quite interesting, in terms of like the rules of the game, as you just described. I was considered to be someone who had won, I was on stage, I had enough money to do what I wanted to do, life was good, and so it's like, why on earth have you jacked all that in to be chasing around after some escaped cows at 3:00 in the morning? I mean, obviously that's not what I did it for, but you get the general idea. What on earth have you done? And that gets people's attention.
Yeah.
And actually, that sense of, I don't regret doing the music. It's been amazing, and I would encourage anyone to do the same thing. But the sense of purpose, like when you get up in the morning and you do hard physical work that's part of a plan that you thought about, that you think is important, there is no better or happier way to spend a day than that. And that's something that just gets so often overlooked in this sort of age of a lot of kind of very superficial pleasure that's quick to come and quick to go.
Yeah, I know. That's amazing. I love that. And I think that's exactly, you sort of living that and sharing that story, I guess, particularly to youngsters is such a great thing, because, we're in this, we've been in this culture of sort of, productivity, accumulation, all equals success, and yet actually, as we're increasingly realizing, it's really about our own kind of, inner health and well-being, and the health and well-being of life around us. That's really what we should be maybe measuring success. That's what it's about. And through participating in something which is, building towards that, is a whole different way of showing up in the world. It's so interesting. And I guess on that, Andy, that's one thing I wanted to ask you. Did I get this right? But did you receive a sort of French equivalent of sort of farming knighthood? Would that be right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. You're technically speaking to a chevalier, which is a French knight. Believe it or not, doesn't sound like one. I know. Amazing.
So, this approach that you've obviously taken, I guess it must have raised a few eyebrows when you were embarking on this. But then, can you just tell us a little bit about how that's netted out in France?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely raised a few eyebrows, but I think it's a very interesting thing. I mean, the thing with the farming community is that however you're all tackling the problem, and there's a lot of people still, friends of mine right here, are the absolutely opposite end of the spectrum. But there's definitely a sense of shared struggle and community. Like, you're embarked on a task which is important, and it's tough. And the sense of kind of mutual support amongst all that is a lovely thing to be part of. And despite all the times when it's like the Englishman, we thought he'd gone mad, but now he started using horses to farm with. He's properly lost it. I mean, there must have been a lot of those chats. But nevertheless, when you're in the shit and you make a phone call, they're around in a flash. And that's really nice. And but the knighthood caper was actually, to be fair, for a politician, Stéphane Le Foll he was the French agriculture minister, and he tried to do a lot of good things, in the context of what's achievable in those positions. And he had this.
Seen him, I think. Would I have seen him in a few docs? He's like on some of the climate change sort of docs.
Yeah, that's right. Because he launched this thing called Cap par mille. So the idea that a 0.4% increase in soil carbon each year could keep climate change to within the 2 degree threshold kind of thing. But he really went for it, and continues to be an activist in that field since leaving office. So I had the good fortune to be making some bread, and then Francois Hollande came down to our local town, and I was the one who ended up turning it with a loaf, and I ended up having lunch with Francois and some of his cabinet, and then he must have said to Le Foll that there's an Englishman making a decent loaf or something, and before you knew it,
brilliant.
I was in Paris with my best suit on.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. It's funny, do you know what? I actually won in my in Bath here. We had a local bake-off, Widcombe bake-off, and which I won with my sourdough. And the judge was Richard Bertonet, who's a baker here in Bath and
wow,
beyond. And he's also a Frenchman. And he when he gave me the award, he said to everyone, he said, this guy's bread could do very well in a bakery anywhere in this city, which I was quite proud of.
Nice work.
Exactly. And I guess that's the other thing, when we talk about climate, when we talk about soils, is how much carbon is released right into into the atmosphere through this kind of turning over, this ploughing of soils, right, and digging and stuff. And again, there's this sort of countercultural thing, isn't it, that we don't quite grasp. And there's that great thing, was it in the film Kiss the Ground? They did that sort of speeded up satellite imaging of the world.
Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah. And I guess that's the thing, I always think, are other farmers, really grasping that? There's this sort of, I guess, interesting tension, like you say, between your livelihood and producing and being able to kind of sort of survive, and then this kind of longer term, bigger issue of climate. And the future. What's going on?
It is, and it's kind of crazy that we've created a system that juxtaposes those two things, and that in itself is proof enough that the system isn't working. And the carbon thing is tough, because there's a lot of chat about that and creating carbon markets and incentivizing farmers to put carbon in the soil, because the potential of that is huge. And when people think of sequestering carbon, they tend to think about trees,
right?
But the thing with trees is that they store their carbon above ground, where it can be chopped down or it can burn down. Whereas well-managed grasslands or agricultural lands, they store their carbon below ground, where you have the potential to make it stable over very, very long timescales. Actually, the potential of grassland to sequester carbon often exceeds that of forests. So you've got 70% of, just talking about the UK, which is obviously a postage stamp, but 70% of the UK is agricultural land. It's an ecosystem which is re-engineered twice a year, and so there's an enormous opportunity there. We're already changing this landscape twice a year already, so we can change that very quickly in a way which will make a very, very significant difference to the carbon situation. But in terms of like the finances, that is hard, because it's carbon cycling is complicated. It's very, very hard to measure. And so, coming up with a sort of definitive price per ton is going to be hard, I think. And I think we have to take a more holistic approach to just putting value on things that are important. And there's nothing more important than the state of our food and the state of our ecosystems, because ultimately that's the state of ourselves.
Yeah, right. 100%. So you've got the new farm coming in the UK. You've got obviously other farms that you're working with and landowners. What does the next few years look like in terms of, you've obviously got this real emerging interest now in the methodology. But yeah, what's coming up for you now? How do you keep on top of what feels like is accelerating quite fast?
Yeah, no, I mean it is a bit full on at the moment. Sort of emigrating in times of quarantine travel is a unnecessary icing on the cake, really. But we'll get through it. But yeah, I mean basically it's building communities. That's the most important thing, and then I've got various ideas as to how I can improve the farming technique, which I'm very excited about. And we're also, as Wild Farm, working with a couple of quite significant landowners for whom we're going to be managing some large areas from this autumn. And they're areas where there's been very intensive farming going on. So I think there's a huge potential there, just to show how quick, just to do what has happened in France and just show how quickly these things can become a real oasis in the desert. And I think that the zeitgeist feels like it's with us in the same way that it did for Sasha at Shelley's in 1992.
Yeah, brilliant. And he's still going.
Yeah, he's still going, exactly.
And exactly. I still follow him on Instagram. I still listen to his mix. It's amazing. So thinking about folks out there who want to connect with the Wildfarmed Grain mission, what's the best way to join in and get involved?
Well, I think that fundamentally every bag of flour that goes out the door is, on the one end, is another farmer who we can go to and say, do this, and you'll get properly paid for it. And so whether that's bakers or home cooks or people making their morning muffins or whatever, it's it's not. We're not in a position where it's available everywhere yet, but I would just say that if you're interested in the story and you want to get involved, we're trying to build a community here. So send an email to info@wildfarmedgrain.com. Let us know what you're up to, and we'll work together on it in whatever capacity that might be.
Amazing. Well, I can I can speak for the flour. I've been using it for a couple of months, and I love it. And it tastes gorgeous. And, I've just done my first big bulk order now. So that's it. I'm converted.
Yeah.
This household is now Wildfarmed Grain officially. No, I think it's amazing, Andy. I absolutely love what you're doing. And I think you're right. It's such an interesting time to sort of, pull all these threads around that you're doing with this approach. And it's making me think as well, like how does this methodology, it sort of feels like it could work on all kinds of other areas of our sort of plant-based food system as well, right? These kind of relationships that you're developing between, customer, grower, and all these folks in between, and obviously the land itself. But yeah, it just feels like this approach could travel, beyond the grain as well, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. Beyond the Grain is actually is a title of another brilliant book on the story of wheat. If you're a wheat fanatic, that's another one to recommend.
What's that one called?
It's called. Oh no, it's not called Beyond the Grain. It's called Against the Grain. Absolutely nice. Fascinating history of civilization and our relationship to staple cereal crops, which that sounds like a really boring introduction to a book, but it's actually great. I sold them a bit short there. It is a page turner in a kind of farming kind of way.
Yeah, so good. So one last question, Andy, that's come up for me I wanted to ask you is what you've seen through, I guess, the relationship with biodiversity in the wider natural world. What have you really witnessed how that whole system has been impacted through your methodology and approach?
Yeah, I mean it's spectacular, and one of the things that I like to do with the younger farm visitors is that luckily just down the end of the drive there's a farm, organic farm actually, but where they're growing soybeans and wheat in a sort of plough based setting. And the soils down here are knackered, as described at the beginning. And so when the kids come, I say, right, who here is a vegetarian or a vegan? And I was vegetarian for 25 years, so I'm fine with it. But quite a few hands go up these days. I'm like, right, well, the most vegan thing you can eat is 100% grass-fed beef from a mob-grazed herd, which creates uproar, as you could imagine. And so then the next bit is say, right, here's some spades. Go down to that field down there where the soybeans are, or the wheat, depending on the time of year, the neighbour's field. And anyone who can find a worm, they got free run on the pain au chocolat in the bakery. And so everyone goes down there, scrabbling around, and no one can find a worm, ever. I've never lost that bet. I said, okay, forget the worm. Go
That's
down and find
field,
it.
right?
Yeah, this is on the conventionally.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, on the conventionally farmed field. And then it's okay, forget the worm, go and find anything that moves. And generally, I don't lose that bet either. And then we go into the pastures, and it's just humming. I mean, you can literally hear it humming. And there are birds all over the place, and you put your spade in the ground, and it's full of worms and all kinds of other visible life, never mind the invisible life. And this is soil that's still got a long way to go. It's a long process. But 10 years ago, this was the soil down at the end of the drive. And so, I was vegetarian for 25 years. I've got slightly off topic here. But my point is that in terms of like restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, I think the symbiosis between between grass and grass eaters has a capacity to turn things around at a speed in the overall picture of life. It means that I'm convinced that a small amount of 100% grass-fed meat of some or whatever description is a price that's worth paying for overall biodiversity restoration.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting one, isn't it? Because again, in our sort of binary world, people tend to go, "Oh no, but you can't eat animals. You've got to be vegan." But again, what you're saying is we need diversity. It's all about these relationships that exist.
It's all about relationships and communities, exactly. Soil, human, and ecological.
Yeah, I was listening to this. I can't remember exactly what it was, but this story recently about a dairy farm that was now experimenting with oat production, still using his herd, but he downsized the size of the herd significantly, and it sounded like a similar sort of approach to yourself. This relationship between mob grazing, moving the herd across the landscape, and then they're creating an oat plant dairy on the farm, which was fascinating, and then having some beef at the end of the year as well. But like you say, the beef is almost a byproduct.
Yeah.
The beef is actually just a byproduct of this process of bringing this life back.
Well, that's exactly the same. The beef at my place is a byproduct of soil life restoration. That's really interesting. I'm interested to know where that place was actually.
Yeah, I'll dig it out. I can't remember whether I heard it, but I'll dig it out. But this is what's so fascinating, I think, about this stuff. There's this sort of beautiful sort of complexity that sort of goes against this dominant narrative that we have, where everyone shouts, "Oh, you can't eat meat," and actually, yeah, there's this really interesting sort of need for these relationships and these communities of life to exist together.
Here's to that.
Amazing. Listen, Andy, thank you so much for this conversation. Totally love what you're doing, and really, really looking forward to seeing how it all develops here in the UK, and we'll be looking out for that. And I'll link to all the stuff you've talked about and point people to Wildfarmed Grain, and just kind of massive vibes to you for it all.
Oh, thanks, mate. Yeah, no, it's been great to talk it through. Two survivors from a previous era.
Yeah, exactly. Still alive, vaguely making a living. It's all good. So listen, I always close the show with the metaphor of the spaceship Earth, and this idea of becoming crew, more of us becoming crew on the spaceship Earth. I was just curious about what that might speak to you right now in 2021.
Yeah, I was meant to think about this. Yeah, no, I basically it would be something on the lines of that. For a very long time now, we've been passengers watching various versions of kings and queens fighting it out for control of the ship, and throwing us various distractions down the back end, of which there are more and more and more to keep us quiet. And we got to put those distractions down, and by becoming crew in sufficient numbers, just to say that's enough, guys. We're taking over the controls of this thing. And I think in doing that, if we all swear an oath of allegiance, which is along the lines of anything that we do to this spaceship, we do to ourselves, then we won't go far wrong.
Beautiful. Love that. Listen, Andy, thanks so much for this and for the time. Masses of positive vibes to you and the Wildfarmed Grain crew and what you're doing. And I'll be right alongside the mission, spreading the good word via my loaves here in Bath, and look forward to connecting when you're settled into the new farm. And yeah,
I'll give you a shout, mate. Come on over.
Yeah, I'd love that. Nice one, Andy.
All right, thanks, mate. Have a nice evening.
Be in touch. So you enjoyed that one. What an incredible human Andy Cato is. Do check out Wildfarmed Grain in the links in the show notes. And get supporting this system. The flower rocks, by the way. Get involved. If you like this podcast, please give us a review. It will take 60 seconds max, and it will help other people find the podcast, or just share it with anyone that you think will like it. That'll be much appreciated. You can sign up to the monthly newsletter, Becoming Crew. You can follow us on Instagram, which is @thespaceship.earth. You can leave us a donation or a price of a cuppa if you like an episode. You can do all of that via the website, thespaceship.earth. Okay, I'm going to play out with a track, obviously. This is a new track from Sasha. Yep, Sasha is still going and going strong, in my opinion. It's a track called Corner Shop. It's from his Luzo Scura project and album, which I heartily recommend. Thanks for supporting the podcast. Take it easy out there. Until next time, peace and out.